Well, hello. Thank you so much for joining us for this online message at Deep Rivers Church. A few things going on that we want to let you know about besides the regular events. This coming Friday night, we're having our art night. We've done this before, and it was a lot of fun, and a lot of people came. So Friday night, 7 o'clock, come and do something creative for art night. Other things going on, we are having a beginners, it's called the DNA of DRC. It's a pathway class to find out more about the church, and that's scheduled for the end of the month. I'm looking at the bulletin right here. February 22nd, it's a Saturday morning at 8:30. We got a verse of the week. We got a spiritual discipline of the month. So check the email, check our Facebook page, and you'll see all the things that are going on. Next week, not this week, but next week, we're starting 2 more equipped classes. Nicole is going to lead one at our home on inductive Bible study, and I'm going to lead one here at the church on spiritual warfare. There's actually been a request made that we would have a conversation about that. All right, let's get right to it as we're in the middle of a sermon series on spiritual disciplines. I came up with a list of maybe possibly the top 10 most confusing Bible passages. I'm going to read them off to you. Does the Old Testament condemn, I should say, does the Old Testament condemn wearing mixed cloth and eating shellfish? If you're familiar with the Old Testament law, the dietary law, and even this law about not wearing clothes made of 2 kinds of fabric. All right, kind of confusing. Number 2. Should Christians submit to the government in all circumstances? That has some controversy to it. Number 3, what does it mean for a camel to go through the eye of a needle? Number 4, do angels really walk and live among us? Number 5, what does Jesus say? Why does Jesus say to hate our mother and our father? Who were the Nephilim? Again, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, it's a confusing passage. Can Jesus do anything apart from the Father? There's some really interesting theology with that question. Did Jesus come to bring peace or the sword? And the next one, should we really heap fiery coals on our enemies? Here's 9 kind of confusing passages. What do they really mean? This last one, the 10th one, is the one I want to talk about this weekend. It's, what does it mean to work out your salvation? What does it mean when we're told in Philippians chapter 2 to work out our salvation? Now, the phrase work out seems like it should go in a sermon series on the spiritual disciplines. They seem like a great fit. So let's jump into Philippians chapter 2. Now, actually, this passage, I could almost call it over the week, it kept expanding. Let me explain. At first, I was just going to include verses 12 and 13, Philippians 2, verses 12 through 13, but as the week went on, the passage just got bigger and bigger. So I'm going to read for everyone Philippians 2, verses 5 through 15, because I think you have to see the context of what's going on to really understand verses 12 and 13. So Paul wrote this: in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus, who being the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Then we get to verses 12 and 13. Therefore, my dear friends, as you always obey, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. So why did this passage expand over the week? Why did it grow from 2 verses all the way up to the 11 that I read? It's because there's not one, but there's 2 therefores in this passage. The word therefore shows up twice. So therefore is a contrasting word. So we have to take a look at it. Context is king, if you've ever heard that phrase before. So the context of this idea of working out your salvation, it starts off with Jesus humbled himself. Jesus humbled himself, taking on the form of man. Therefore, he was exalted. And because of that, we will all bow and confess him as Lord. Since our knees and our tongues will acknowledge him, therefore, the second therefore, we obey and work out our salvation. Why do we work out our salvation? Why do we obey? It's because every tongue is going to confess and every knee is going to bend and bow. So this word therefore is important. Don't miss the connection between Jesus and our expected obedience as followers. Jesus humbled himself, and we're to have the same mindset as him. So we humble ourselves. Jesus humbled himself, therefore he was exalted. And because he exalted, therefore we humble ourselves. So here's this phrase, work out your salvation. In fact, some translations will include the word own, to work out your own salvation. So what does it mean? Well, we know what Paul did not mean. He did not mean to work so as to earn your salvation. I hope that is obvious to everybody. That would contradict Paul's gospel. It contradicts all the New Testament teaching on grace, that we're saved by faith and not by work. So when we say work out your salvation, it's not a work to earn your salvation. What Paul did mean is that he's calling the Philippians and us to put a real effort into our Christian lives. This is not to accomplish it, but to make it evident in our lives. We've got to put forth some effort to make this faith evident, noticeable to others, to make it seen in our lives. We don't accomplish our salvation by our works, obviously, but we make it evident by leaning into it. Here's a quote by Charles Spurgeon, and I worked it around a little bit and reworded it, but the point is the same. These words are not an exhortation to everyone. Get this is important. These words are not an exhortation to everyone. They are directed to the people of God. They are not intended as an exhortation to the unsaved or the unconverted. They are, beyond question, addressed to those who are already saved through a living faith in Jesus Christ. Simply put, Paul's not writing this to non-Christians. He's writing it to people of the faith. He's writing it to people who have already claimed Christ. So why would he tell them to work when they are already saved? It's not a working for your salvation. Our salvation is complete. Jesus has done a complete work for us. You could say our salvation might be incomplete in quotes in that it's not yet a complete work in us. We are saved, yes. Our eternity with him is set because of our faith in the work of the cross. Now it needs to be worked into us. It's this idea of positional holiness and our practical, or I could say lived holiness. Positionally, we are holy. Now we need to do something to work that out, to see it seen in our lives. We must practically apply to its fullest consequences what God has already given to us in principle. We must work out what God has worked in. Does he get it? We must work out. God has made us holy. It's in us. We must work out what God has already put in. Another quote I reworded it a little bit. For some, the grace of God is like a drug that leads to slumber. Our desire for stronger doses leads to the belief God works in us, therefore there is nothing for us to do. This is a bad reasoning and a wrong conclusion. God works, says the text, therefore we must work out because God works in. God's at work. The passage I just read says that God's working in us. Because he's working in us, we join him in that work. It is interesting too, the passage says your salvation, and as I mentioned, another translation includes the word own, your own salvation. And the point of that little nuance is that it's important that we give attention to our own salvation. At times, we show great concern for the work in others and not enough for his work in us. We should care about the souls of others, obviously, but this care begins with our own soul first. So yes, we need to be evangelistic, if you will. We are evangelical Christians for a reason. So we need to have a heart for others, a burden for others, but we also need to be aware of where we're at, look at our own lives maybe with a little bit more introspection instead of just looking at where other people are lacking. Where are we? How can we tend to our own souls better? With fear and trembling. Again, we know what Paul did not mean. We don't live with a constant dread or anxiety. Instead, we fear, in quotes, we fear maybe falling short of what God desires for us. You could kind of call this the if only I and the heavenly remorse. I don't know what heaven's like, and I don't know if we'll experience regret. But is there a chance in heaven we will look back at our time and think, man, if only I would have done this, if only I would have done that. There might be a sense that we look back and see all the missed opportunities. Again, heaven is heaven and it's going to be amazing. But how can we live our lives now to avoid the if-onlys? People at the end of their lives, they look back. Sometimes they have regret. They think, I should have done more. I could have done more. Okay? So how do we live our lives trying to avoid that measure of remorse or even regret? And again, this idea of working out your salvation with fear and trembling, it's not a fear of hell or punishment. Let's please understand that. It's but the righteousness-filled reverence for God that every believer should have. So this fear and trembling, it's not a fear of punishment, but it's the righteous, awe-filled reverence that we should have as believers, of reverence and awe-filled reverence. It doesn't have to be, think about this, it doesn't have to be a scared trembling of a guilty sinner, but maybe possibly a joyful trembling of an encounter with the glory of God. When we think of trembling, we just think of it as in, the negative, being scared, but maybe it's a joyful trembling when we really stand and recognize the awe of God. Again, just to wrap it up, Paul asked for a Christian work ethic, not a works ethic. Do you see the difference? We are to be people that are doing something, not a works salvation, but because of our salvation, we do something. As I mentioned before, we work and God works. Paul says this, we work out our salvation with fear and trembling because God is working in us. Because God is doing a work in us, we now have the responsibility to walk diligently with him. It's because he's at work in us that we walk diligently. God's work in us, in fact, increases our responsibility. It doesn't lessen it in any way. It's easy to take advantage of God's grace. We need to take great care not to do that. It's called using God's sovereignty as an excuse for inaction or passiveness. And when we do that, we can easily become the lazy servant that Jesus talked about in Matthew 25. Understanding God's sovereignty motivates us to a greater, more dedicated service to him. But like I said, there's even more. God works to transform our will and our desires as well as our actions. So in light of this plea to work out your salvation, this is also not a passive transaction. God's at work in us. We live that out by intentionally walking with him, working out our salvation. And why? What's God's motive in all this? Because it gives him good pleasure to do it. The more that God works in us, the more that we partner with him, if you will, in this, the more it gives him pleasure. I want to just take, I know, kind of a short message as I look at the time. Maybe I'm going too fast. A closer look at these three phrases: work out, fear, and trembling. Work out. Again, when you hear the word workout, we think of a physical exercise. But in this context, it's to continually work to bring something to completion or fruition. When we work out, we're doing something, a continual work, because we want to see fruit. We want to see something done. We want to see something accomplished. We actively pursue obedience in the process of our sanctification. Again, we've talked about this, and it's worth repeating. Justification is the event when God declares you not guilty. It's when the judge's gavel falls. He declares you not guilty and forgiven of your sin. That is your justification. Your sanctification, again, is a lifelong process of your behavior catching up to what you already are. We partner with God in our sanctification. There's nothing we can do to partner with God in our justification. This very next chapter, chapter 3 of Philippians, Paul says he's straining and pressing on to the goal of Christ-likeness. So positionally, we are like Christ, but here Paul, very next chapter, Philippians chapter 3, he's saying he's straining and pressing on in that goal for his behavior to catch up to who and what he really is. Again, that word fear. The very next chapter, the main passage is Philippians chapter 2. We talk about Philippians chapter 3, Paul's straining and pressing on. Philippians chapter 4, the very next chapter, Paul writes about having the peace of God. So how can he connect fear to work out your salvation with fear and trembling? In the very next chapter, he's talking about how we need to experience, or we can experience, the peace of God. So obviously, Paul's not encouraging us to live with a nervous anxiety. This undermines his appeal to live with a peace of mind, a courage, and a confidence of God. Again, it's I think it's fair to say that the Bible is one of the Bible's purposes, I think you say, is for us to experience peace because of our relationship with God. But this phrase, fear and trembling, is actually kind of a familiar phrase in Paul's writing. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 says Paul came with weakness, fear, and trembling to the Corinthian church. He was mindful of the great nature of his work for God. So when he's telling us to live out our faith with fear and trembling, he's also using that same phrase when he says, I went to the Corinthian church. When I went there, I had fear and trembling because I was aware of the great nature of the work that I was doing on behalf of God. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 7, in a separate other letter, Paul uses the phrase, when Titus was received with fear and trembling. It shows that the people were treated him with humility and respect. So all this means that fear doesn't mean being scared. Fear means reverence and respect. And again, that might be hard for us to really rewire our brains on that. Fear is not being scared. Fear means having reverence and respect. As we wrap things up, this word trembling, it's an attitude we are to have in pursuing this goal. The healthy fear of offending God through our disobedience. It's an awe and respect for his majesty and his holiness. But trembling, same way we can think about fear differently. Trembling can also be a shaking due to weakness, a weakness that actually has a higher purpose. It causes us to fall into a deeper state of dependency on God. So trembling, again, It's an attitude we have in pursuing a goal, healthy fear of not following through or falling into disobedience, which happens. People they take advantage of God's grace. They easily fall into that trap. So it's an awe and respect for His holiness, but it's also shaking due to weakness. And again, it's a thing that puts us in a deeper state of dependency on God. Obedience and submission to God. When we do that, we revere and respect, and it's our reasonable service. So all this is a reasonable act. I think we talked about that last week in Romans chapter 12. One last verse to share. Psalm 2:11 says, "Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling." So when Paul's encouraging us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, we need to remember the right context of doing that. We serve the Lord with fear and we rejoice in trembling because we recognize the majesty of God. The sermon series that we're doing, we end each on spiritual disciplines. We ended each message so far with a tip. How do we incorporate these spiritual disciplines into our lives? This week's tip is just an encouragement to keep experimenting and don't give up when you fail. Acknowledge your mistakes, learn what doesn't work, stay curious, and take your discouragement to the Lord to find grace. So let's keep pressing in to the spiritual disciplines. Last month was getting into God's Word. This month of February, the spiritual discipline is simplicity. What can we do to simplify our life? That could be events and busyness of our calendar. It could also be just the physical things that we have surrounded ourselves with. Those are just two ways. So I want to encourage all of us this year as we look through these disciplines to don't give up when you fall. Don't give up when you fail, I should say. Acknowledge your mistakes, learn from what doesn't work. Stay curious and take your discouragement to God to find the grace to get up again and keep trying. All right, so again, just thank you so much. We might have snow tonight on Saturday night, so hopefully we'll all be here together. If not, then maybe you're going to watch this video for church. We'll find out. All right, thanks so much. Take care and God bless. Bye.